Iain Dale, it is a pleasure to catch up with you. I'm actually a big fan, so it's been a while, but we finally have a reason to talk to you because you've got your brand new book.
I do.
It's out here, and we can see it behind you as well. Why can't we all just get along, shout less, listen more? How have you had time to write a book? Because you're very busy. You've got a lot on. Even someone that perhaps, if someone doesn't follow you quite as much as I do, even just refreshing your Twitter feed, you're a busy man. How did you have time to squeeze this into your day job?
Well, I wrote it over a period of 6 months, I suppose, and I just got so frustrated with the level of public discourse in this country, where people just feel nowadays that they can say anything to anyone without consequence, particularly on social media. So it was, I just wanted to understand why this had happened, and maybe to look at some of the ways that we can all improve ourselves. And look, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll know that I was part of the problem. If somebody insulted me, which lots of people do on Twitter, my instant human reaction was to respond in kind, or even to make it worse. And in the end, I thought, this cannot go on. If I behave like this, as somebody who's vaguely in the public eye, then I can't really criticise others for doing it. I don't think I've said anything really terrible, but it's such a spontaneous medium, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And I think people have to look themselves in the mirror a little bit about exactly how they're behaving.
Do you think things have got better or worse if we compare what we're currently talking about in the middle of a pandemic to the likes of a general election, perhaps back in 2019, or even Brexit? In terms of public discourse, do you think it's become pejorative? Do you think things have got worse? Or do you think, on reflection, things are getting better? Where do you stand on that?
I think during the pandemic, things have got a bit better. I think it has brought people together. I remember that phrase that David Cameron used to use, the big society. Well, we have seen people come together in the pandemic. Neighbours have got to know each other in a way that they didn't before, done things for each other in a way that maybe they didn't before. So from that point of view, I think it has improved. But let's not pretend that we haven't always had robust debate in this country. You look back at the political cartoons of the 18th, 19th centuries, and they would depict scenes that are far more robust than anything you see in the House of Commons today. So we've always been a nation of robust debate, and there's nothing wrong with robust debate. It's just when it transcends into abuse that we really have to worry. And I think it did that during the Brexit referendum in a way that I've never seen happen before.
You talk a lot about, your political interviews. You talked, I remember actually listening to you on the media show where I think you had Andrew Marr in dismay because you said you don't often prepare questions, perhaps, for interviews. But do you think, you talk about some of those gotcha moments. We see it quite a lot at the moment. Some of the kind of perhaps interviews gearing more towards grabbing the headlines after they've happened than perhaps, finding out things at the time. Do you think we're moving away from that, or do you think those gotcha moments are still very much at play?
Well, they are still very much at play, and you can understand why it happens. Because if you think of most news programs, for example, breakfast shows, where inevitably you've got the interviewer has only got 4 or 5 minutes to do an interview. The producer is shouting in his ear to get a line from a minister. And you get these ridiculous moments where the interviewer says, you ought to be ashamed of yourself, Minister. Why don't you resign? Well, politicians are human beings, believe it or not. And if you are under attack, your shutters go up, your defences go up, and therefore you don't say anything apart from the sound bites that you've been pre-programmed to say by your special advisor. So the only people that lose out there are the listeners. However, there is light at the end of the tunnel, because I think podcasts in particular, and indeed YouTube, are allowing longer interviews to take place. So I do a podcast called Iain Dale Talk, where I interview people, not just politicians, but lots of others too. It can be for an hour, it can be for an hour and a half. There isn't a time limit. I don't have to stop an interview. Those awful words that you hear, I'm sorry, that's all we've got time for. On the internet, that doesn't really matter. You can go on for hours if you want. I listened to a West Ham podcast the other day that was 3.5 hours long. Now, even I thought that was a bit long. But I mean, if you've got an interesting interview going on and the interviewee is opening up, why would you suddenly stop it? It's completely artificial to do it. So I think there is a bit of light at the end of the tunnel there.
Well, we have your book, so we have plenty of time to get through this. It's not just 10 minutes. We've got lots of reading to get through. You talk in it about standing as a Conservative Party candidate. You say that perhaps now you're better prepared than you would have ever been back then if you were to do it. You say that you haven't really considered it. Do you think it's something that you would ever do again? Now you're kind of in the public discourse. Do you feel like you've built up that thick skin to go out there and perhaps do it again now that you're speaking to people on a daily basis?
No, is the honest answer. Look, in this country, if you're not involved in national politics by the age of 40 or 45, you might as well not bother. It's not the same in other countries. In other countries, when you're in your 50s or your 60s and you've got a track record of achievement behind you, that's when you go into politics. I'm not saying that everyone should be in their 70s like the two US presidential candidates, but I now feel that I would be a far better politician if I went into politics now, but I'm 58. Very rarely does anyone get elected in their late 50s or early 60s. And if you do get elected, you're never really ever going to be a minister. And that's the only real way that you can change things if you become a minister. So I decided in 2010 that I wasn't going to try again. I tried once. It was kind of one of those situations where you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. I fought a seat in North Norfolk, which did go back to the Conservatives in 2019. Well, the guy, Duncan Baker, that won it then, he was in the right place at the right time. That's the way the cookie crumbles. I would have liked to have been an MP. I think I would have been really good at all the constituency side. Possibly I would have got frustrated by the Westminster politics. I don't know, but we shall never know.
And just finally, you obviously share a lot of anecdotes of your LBC show. I saw you recently celebrated an anniversary for that as well. So congratulations. That's a nice landmark to get to. There was a caller, I think, last Thursday night called Ali, and I just want to quote him. He was talking about Boris Johnson, and you do get some interesting callers. He said, he's a rubbish tip. He's full of rubbish. And I remember thinking at the time, that is just one of many callers you have on an evening that have some quite interesting takes. Is that quite refreshing? Some of them generally a lot more lighthearted than others, but is that nice, do you think, even though that's a little bit of silly discourse, perhaps not the most positive thing, it kind of is a little bit more refreshing than some of the harder stuff you sometimes get on social?
Well, the great thing about hosting a phone-in show is that you never know what the next person is going to say. They could have the most emotional, heart-rending story that actually moves you to tears, or they could be quite humorous, like Ali was. And as you say, I've been doing this now for 10 years, and it is an absolute privilege. It's the best job I've ever had. And there are so many moments down the years that I can think back to, that when I'm sort of dribbling in my retirement home for bewildered broadcasters in Worthing in 20 years' time, maybe even 10 years' time, I will think back on those calls, think, well, wow, people phoned me and they told me the most personal stories, because I don't just cover politics. I do lots of emotional phone-ins on depression, on sexual abuse, all that sort of thing. And I'm constantly amazed at the number of people who will ring me and tell me their most personal stories, which they've never told anyone else before. And I think it's because they listen to you every evening and you become a sort of almost a friend to them, the friend that you've never met. And that is a wonderful, wonderful medium. And the internet may have killed off some forms of media, it's killing off national newspapers. But actually, it's not killed off radio. People still want to have a conversation. And the most intimate way to do that in a public sphere is actually on the radio. So I've never really wanted to be a TV presenter, because you can't get that same relationship between you and the audience that you can on radio.